or the previous way in which the six has functioned. For hundreds of years now, we've been in a mutative process in which the sixth line has stopped being a binary process, which it was in the past. That is, you would have your subjective phase and then you would have your objective phase until you died. We now live with a sixth line theme, which is a triplicity. That is, you go through the subjective and the objective in order to get to a place in which those things do not matter. And that's really the essence of it. You can see in the organic way, the way we've been looking at the structure, is that the six has a very different job. It's not a marker. It's not the responsibility of the six to be that attractive force that's recognized on the outside. It's the responsibility of the six to be the embodiment of the message. And the message is the embodiment of what the hexagram really is as a potential, but not as a potential as an indicator, but as a potential as a mutative force that can actually transform the next link in the chain. You know, the transpersonal value of the six is that it has a direct ability to be able to mutate the other. And it has a direct ability to be able to mutate the other simply through being different, that is, through its differentiation. In other words, being a model. But not a model in the sense that the model is here to be followed, but the model is simply to be recognized. In other words, the recognition of the integrity of self, the recognition of the integrity of individual authority. All of those things are present or intended to be present in the way in which the six operates. In other words, what the six represents is the hexagram operating as it should. And when the hexagram operates as it should, then it's going to have a positive impact on what it's connected to, and thus the chain of mutative potential or mutative events. It's interesting from the evolutionary point of view to find the presence of six-line mutation to be fascinating because we get to experience evolution, yet at the same time I recognize how difficult it is in the reality of the unique life to live out a sixth line in your profile. It does mean that there is an inherent instability in your life, that inherent instability is the first phase of your life, which makes it even more unpredictable. It means that so much of that is conditioned by the nature of the environment that you're raised in, your parents, your culture, your education. It goes on and on and on. In the personal life, it's a dilemma. Let's look at this as logically as we possibly can. You have a phase where you're supposed to have experience, but remember, the essential experience of the third line is to enter into correctly those things that are right that will go wrong, or those things that are right that can go wrong. So that's the first criteria. In other words, the first criteria for a six-line being in the first 28 years of their life is they enter correctly into those things that it's right that it will go wrong, if it does. Now, of course, we know that the not-self doesn't function that way. In other words, the not-self simply enters into things that go wrong, period. And they don't enter into them correctly. So not only do they go wrong, but there is no intrinsic value from the experience. In other words, if you go into the right things that are supposed to go wrong, you get value from that experience. You know, because the experience isn't a negative, it isn't uncomfortable. You know, it's simply something that doesn't work, and through that something that doesn't work comes an understanding and experiential depth that's a byproduct of that experience. So you start off with a six-line being that has to go through a third-line phase, and if they're not self, and they're going to be not self, then you know right away that most of the experience that they're going to suffer from, the trial and error that they're going to be a part of, doesn't represent essential material for them. Now remember, the whole movement of the six is to become wise, and to become wise in a way that is trustworthy. You know, it's not wisdom that one is skeptical about, but it's wisdom that one has a sense one can trust. And that is that they are the embodiment in that sense of trust. But we've already seen that wisdom and trustworthiness are not natural things that you're born with. You know, these are things that develop through a process. So what happens to the six-line being when they reach their first Saturn cycle, when they go up onto the roof, the interregnum phase, the phase between Saturn and Chiron, somewhere around 20, 21 years, 22 years, 23 years, that phase on the roof, that when they get to that phase on the roof, that this is the objective, but it's not an objective pulled at random. It's the polarity to the subjective they've experienced. In other words, they're expected to gain objective wisdom from the wrong things that went wrong. That's very difficult. And of course, it makes it very difficult for them to move away from their inherent pessimism and to move towards its polarity, which is the optimism of the six on the roof. You know, the six on the roof is full of optimism. Now, it's not full of optimism day one. Everything about the six, because it's a mutative force, is a growth process. You don't start off pessimistic. You become pessimistic. You become pessimistic because things don't work. You become objective because mechanically you're literally pulled away from things. You know, you just are. You go into what is your nature, which is a six-line theme. The moment you go into the six-line theme, you go into different themes. You go into a theme that is rooted in optimism, objectivity, to take your distance from things. But remember, it's what you're taking your distance from that becomes the measurement that leads to your wisdom. After all, you can only take your objective distance from the subjective experience that you've had, because this is the criteria. That's why I've got this heavy trip about third line themes, and beware of that in your children, and please nurture their sense of value, because otherwise they're not going to enter into the right things that will go wrong, and they won't end up being our discoverers and our material adventurers and our explorers and our scientists and all those things. We won't get the advantage of having all of that operating correctly. The other thing is that the sixth line being that has to go through that experience as a child, for them to enter into those things correctly, because it will create the platform upon which their optimism will be based. In other words, they will have the right material to work with. Now, this is not about regrets, regardless of when you got involved in this process. It's simply about understanding that, the way in which this is supposed to work is that you have children who are naturally conditioned to what is their nature, and this is a natural process for them to go with a sense of joy into the exploration of the unknown. Will this work or won't it? To enter into the right things that will go wrong, to learn from that, and then in the objective phase, have a totally different perspective on that phenomena. But having the right criteria upon which to base their objective phase, what to be aloof from, and what that aloofness actually means, what kind of perspective it gives you. But neither of those phases is the point. It's not about, the experiential and the subjective and the aloof and the objective. These are just elements in a developmental process. A developmental process that's intended to flower in the post-Chiron phase. And, that's as mystical as you can get. The pressure to separate. And it's not the pressure to separate in the sense of you don't want to be with anyone else, because it isn't about that. It's about to be able to separate as an example, to be able to separate as a role model, because being separate is just that. In other words, this is what differentiation is all about. And of course, in the end, when we're talking about the genetic matrix, what we're talking about in our own experience, is that we get to live out what we are. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of being awake. The whole point of being awake is that you get to the point where, you are yourself. It's not a point of becoming yourself. It's not a point of deconditioning the not self. You simply are yourself. And when you are yourself, you are your own authority. When you are your own authority, you are fundamentally separate. That's the point. Remember that this is how we learn from each other. How we learn from each other is by being able to distinguish. The greater our potential of knowing is determined by the greater the diversity we represent as truth. In other words, each unique, individuated truth, is an aspect of the greater truth. And we're only going to get close to the greater truth when everybody is speaking their unique truth, what their unique formula is. In the broader context, the sixth line being is carrying that pressure now. And they've been carrying that pressure for hundreds of years. And when I first began to talk about the Chironian cycle and the sixth line, I began by ushering a warning of vulnerability, physical vulnerability. The vulnerability of the sixth line in its first phase, the vulnerability of the sixth line in its final phase. It's one thing to understand about the way in which mutation operates, and that the game of mutation is very cruel. You can tell by now that everything is mutative. It's a constant competition of what mutations are going to take hold and what mutations aren't. This is the way it's always been. And it's an endless competition. Mutation is alive and well, it's all over the place. And so, one of these great forces for us is to recognize that all of the six lines are under this tremendous mutative pressure. And if you don't mutate, if the mutation isn't viable, it's immediately eliminated.